"Sir, you're under citizen's arrest for destroying our property values." That's what Brenda Kesler screamed at me, a 52-year-old retired electrician who just wanted to drink coffee in peace, while shoving her iPhone in my face and blocking my own front door. The smell of her expensive perfume mixed with the morning pine air as two embarrassed deputies shuffled behind her in the snow. She thought she'd caught me red-handed with my illegal cabin, had her whole Facebook live stream ready. Watch me take down this code violator, except I wasn't violating anything. I was standing on federal forest land that I legally lease for $127 a year. Every board, every nail, every stone in that chimney was properly permitted and federally approved. What happened next? Let's just say her live stream got a lot more views than she bargained for, but not for the reasons she expected. Drop your location below and tell me, have you ever seen someone try to arrest someone on federal property? My name's Garrett Walsh, and if you'd told me 2 years ago that I'd be locked in a legal battle with my HOA over a cabin I built on federal land, I'd have checked your pulse. Back then, I was just another union electrician with calloused hands and a pension plan, working high-voltage lines and coming home to Linda every night for 32 years. Cancer took her 18 months ago. Pancreatic, the express train to nowhere. One day we're planning our retirement cabin. The next I'm sitting in a house that smells like her lavender soap and sounds like a tomb, wondering what the hell I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life. That cabin wasn't just lumber and nails. It was our last dance together. Linda had spotted the location during one of our Sunday drives through Pine Ridge Estates, pointing to a wooded 40-acre lot that backed against endless forest. "Right there, Garrett. That's where I want to drink coffee and watch you pretend to fish." I bought it with my disability settlement after a high-voltage accident convinced my spine that retirement wasn't optional anymore. The lot had character, mostly pine trees, rocky slopes, and the kind of silence that makes city folks nervous. Perfect for a blue-collar guy who'd spent 3 decades listening to Transformers hum. Here's where it gets interesting. The 1970s survey had screwed up my property line. My lot actually extended into what the maps called National Forest. Could have been a headache, but the Forest Service has this thing called a special use permit. Basically, Uncle Sam rents you the right to build on certain lands, cost $127 a year. I spend more on work boots. Building that cabin saved my sanity. The satisfying cracks of splitting pine logs, sawdust coating my arms like golden snow, the metallic ring of my hammer echoing off distant peaks. Coffee steam curling up in the frigid morning air while I planned each day's work. Every joint I cut, every beam I raised, it was for Linda, even though she'd never see it finished. 24 by 32 feet of hand-hewn perfection. Metal roof that could handle mountain snow, stone chimney built to last centuries. Wraparound porch where I drink my coffee and remember her laugh. Passed every county inspection with flying colors. Hell, the inspector asked for my business card. Then I met Brenda Kesler. Imagine a real estate broker who thinks a clipboard makes her a federal judge. 3-term HOA president married to a city councilman lives in the development's crown jewel with a lawn so perfect it looks artificial. The kind of woman who uses words like property values and community standards like weapons. She showed up 6 months ago wearing stilettos on rough ground, surveying my cabin like a health inspector finding roaches. "This structure doesn't match our architectural guidelines," she announced, her voice carrying that special tone reserved for talking to the help. I showed her my permits, federal documentation, county approvals, the works, offered her coffee from my thermos like any decent neighbor would. "Forest Service permits don't override our authority," she said, dismissing 30 pages of government paperwork with a flick of her French manicure. "You'll modify that metal roof to cedar shingles and remove that industrial chimney, or face daily penalties." See, here's what Brenda didn't say, but her tone made crystal clear. Guys like me, union workers with dirt under their nails, don't belong in her upscale development. We're supposed to build nice houses for professional people, then disappear back to our side of town. Within a week, I had an official HOA violation notice demanding $50 daily fines until I achieved compliance. $50 a day on a fixed income. That's groceries, medications, utilities. She was trying to price me out of my own property. I've dealt with petty dictators my whole career. Foremen who confused volume with authority. Building inspectors fishing for bribes, city bureaucrats drunk on their own power. But this felt personal. This was Linda's dream, our final project together, being attacked by someone who thought money made her untouchable. Brenda Kesler had no idea she'd just picked a fight with a guy who'd spent 30 years making the lights stay on during ice storms. She was about to learn the difference between having authority and being right. 3 weeks later, Brenda called an emergency HOA board meeting. Emergency, like my cabin was about to sprout legs and march down the mountain into town. I got the notice in my mailbox on a Tuesday, meeting scheduled for Thursday night. Barely gave people time to arrange babysitters, which I'm pretty sure was the point. The community center reeked of industrial carpet cleaner and decades of bitter arguments. That special smell of municipal buildings everywhere. Cold metal folding chairs arranged in Judgment Day rows, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps. Brenda had packed the room with faces I didn't recognize, probably called in favors from her real estate network. She'd prepared a whole PowerPoint presentation. PowerPoint. For an HOA meeting. Like she was pitching a hostile corporate takeover instead of trying to evict a widower from his own property. Protecting Pine Ridge Property Values, a Community Crisis, read her title slide, projected on a wobbling screen that had seen better decades. As you can see from these photographs, Brenda clicked through images of my cabin shot from every unflattering angle imaginable. This structure represents a clear violation of our community standards and threatens every homeowner's investment. I had to admit, her photography skills were impressive in an evil genius sort of way. She'd captured my cabin during the messiest construction phases, shot from below to make it look like a fortress looming over the neighborhood, and somehow made my beautiful log work look like something from a horror movie. If I didn't know better, I'd think I was looking at a meth lab. Furthermore, she continued, her voice carrying that smooth real estate agent authority, multiple neighbors have filed formal complaints about construction noise, commercial vehicle traffic, and general disruption to our peaceful community. That was interesting, considering I'd been quieter than a church mouse and had maybe 3 delivery trucks total. But there she stood, waving a stack of complaint forms like evidence in a murder trial. My neighbor Sal Ricci, whose Marine Corps posture hadn't softened a day since Vietnam, raised his hand. Brenda, I live 2 lots over from Garrett, and I never filed any complaint. Matter of fact, I helped him unload lumber. Who exactly complained? Brenda's smile could have sold swampland to tourists. The complainants requested anonymity to avoid potential retaliation. Retaliation. From a guy whose biggest threat was offering unsolicited coffee to anyone who walked by. The woman had more imagination than a Hollywood screenwriter. The board's unanimous recommendation, she announced, is immediate cessation of all construction activities and removal of the non-compliant structure within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 per day beginning Monday, $500 a day. On my disability pension, that was groceries, medications, and utilities combined. She wasn't trying to fine me. She was trying to bankrupt me out of my own home. Time to show my cards. I stood up, manila folder in hand, and walked to the front like I was reporting for duty. 30 years of explaining electrical systems to panicked homeowners had taught me that calm confidence beats volume every time. Brenda, impressive presentation, but I think we might have a jurisdictional issue here. I spread my survey maps across the folding table, the papers crackling in the dead silence. This is my property survey, and this is my special use permit from the United States Forest Service. You could hear the building's ancient HVAC system wheezing while people processed that information. Years ago, back when I was troubleshooting a power grid failure, my supervisor taught me something that stuck. When local regulations conflict with federal standards, federal always wins. It's not negotiable. It's constitutional law, settled back when Andrew Jackson was president. I'd looked it up after my first run-in with Brenda, curious about where exactly the legal lines were drawn. But since we're discussing community standards, I continued, pulling out another document, I did some research on our own compliance issues. I held up the county building records. Turns out this community center we're sitting in violates Pine Ridge's setback requirements by 8 feet. Built in 2018, 2 years after those setbacks became law. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Brenda's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush creeping up her neck. Federal permits don't override our authority. Actually, they do. It's called the Supremacy Clause, been settled law since 1819. I wrote McCulloch v. Maryland on the whiteboard behind me. Anyone who wants to Google that later, knock yourselves out. The meeting collapsed faster than a house of cards in a windstorm. Brenda tried to ram through her fine schedule anyway, but too many people had questions. As neighbors filed out, I noticed something encouraging. They weren't necessarily on my side, but they weren't automatically against me either. Sal clapped my shoulder as I packed up. That was beautiful, Garrett, like watching someone defuse a bomb with a butter knife. I wished I felt as confident as Sal sounded. Brenda's parting glare promised this war was just getting started. 2 weeks after my constitutional law lesson, Brenda went nuclear. straight to the county with a sob story about how this dangerous rogue electrician was terrorizing her peaceful community with his illegal forest fortress. I knew trouble was coming when Jake Morrison's county truck came crunching up my gravel road on a Tuesday morning, diesel exhaust mixing with the smell of pine sap warming in the sun. Jake's the kind of building inspector who actually knows which end of a hammer to hold. Scarred hands, tool belt worn smooth from real use. The type who can spot a structural problem from the parking lot. "Morning, Garrett," he called out, climbing down with a clipboard and that special expression government employees wear when they're being forced to investigate bullshit. "Got a complaint about septic setbacks and permit violations. You know the drill." The complaint was pure fantasy. My septic system had been inspected, approved, and blessed by Jake himself 6 months ago. But Brenda had filed paperwork claiming I'd violated setback requirements from the forest boundary. Creative interpretation of regulations that existed only in her imagination. We walked the property while I explained the federal permit situation again. Jake ran his calloused fingers along my foundation joints like he was reading the stone's life story, testing mortar with his thumbnail, nodding at craftsmanship details most people would never notice. "Your work's better than half the licensed contractors I see," he muttered, checking the cabin's level with his practiced eye. Whoever complained either doesn't know construction or they're flat out lying. While Jake was crawling around my crawl space with his flashlight, I was doing detective work of my own. 3 trips to the county clerk's office, squinting at microfiche until my eyes watered, but persistence pays off when you're hunting dirty laundry. Jackpot. Brenda had sold properties to 4 different Pine Ridge residents over the past 3 years, including 2 current board members. Every single sale contract had the same glaring omission: no disclosure of boundary disputes with the Forest Service. Back when I was shop steward, our old negotiator used to say, "When someone fights you this hard over something simple, follow the money trail. There's always money." Smart man. Real estate agents are legally required to disclose anything that might affect property values, and boundary disputes definitely qualify. I photocopied every transaction, highlighting the missing disclosure sections like evidence in a fraud case. Jake finished his inspection over lunch, filling out his report right there on my kitchen table. The scratch of his pen on carbon paper was the only sound besides coffee percolating and birds chattering outside my windows. "Everything's perfect, Garrett. Septic's textbook. Setbacks are legal. Structure's sounder than most houses I inspect." He tore off the top copy and handed it to me. "Whoever filed this complaint is either incompetent or malicious." "Why not both?" I said, refilling his coffee mug. "Fair point. Listen, this whole mess has the county attorney asking questions. When HOAs start challenging federal permits, everybody's liability insurance gets nervous. Document everything, and I mean everything." That afternoon, I made the 3-hour round trip to the state capitol, filing a formal complaint with the Real Estate Commission. The clerk who processed my paperwork had that 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen every flavor of real estate fraud known to humanity. "Investigation takes 60 to 90 days, she recited in bureaucratic monotone. "Notification by mail. 90 days in legal time is nothing. In HOA warfare, it's roughly 6 eternities. When I got home, my answering machine was blinking like a Christmas tree. The message made my blood pressure spike. "Mr. Walsh, this is attorney David Kesler from Kesler & Associates representing Pine Ridge Estates HOA. We need to discuss your immediate compliance with community covenants. Call my office, Kesler." Same surname as our beloved HOA president. Brother, husband, cousin, didn't matter. What mattered was escalation. She'd graduated from neighborhood bully to professional legal muscle. But here's the beautiful irony. While researching Brenda's real estate deals, I'd stumbled across something delicious. David Kesler, attorney at law, had been the closing agent on 2 of those undisclosed boundary dispute sales. He'd signed off on transactions where his own client, assuming they were related, had failed to disclose material facts. That's not just a conflict of interest. That's potentially conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. I sat on my porch that evening, watching shadows creep across the valley while mountain air carried the scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. The attorney's message was supposed to intimidate me, but all it did was confirm what I'd suspected. Brenda wasn't just protecting her authority anymore. She was protecting her money. And if there's one thing 30 years of union work taught me, it's that people get real stupid when their wallets are threatened. They make mistakes. They overreach. They leave evidence lying around. Time to see exactly how stupid Brenda and her lawyer brother could get. Attorney David Kesler's office reeked of expensive cologne and cheap desperation. That particular cocktail you smell in conference rooms right before someone makes a career-ending mistake. I'd driven into town for our mandatory consultation, which turned out to be 45 minutes of legal theater starring a man who'd clearly never worked a day with his hands. David had the soft look of someone who'd inherited his practice instead of earning it. Manicured nails, dental work that cost more than my truck, and family photos strategically positioned to remind visitors of his political connections. Behind his mahogany desk hung diplomas from schools I'd never heard of and handshake photos with politicians I didn't care about. "Mr. Walsh," he began, sliding a folder thick enough to choke a horse across his polished desk. "My client is prepared to be reasonable. Remove the structure voluntarily, and we'll waive accumulated fines." The folder contained enough legal paperwork to start a small bonfire: cease and desist orders, violation notices, architectural review demands. At the bottom lurked the real threat: a lawsuit seeking $75,000 in damages, claiming my cabin was a continuing nuisance that devastated neighboring property values. "Generous offer," I said, keeping my voice steady as a multimeter reading. "But I'm curious about something. What's your relationship to Brenda Kesler?" His politician's smile flickered like a dying fluorescent tube. "I represent the Homeowners Association in this matter." "Right, but Brenda Kesler specifically." "Wife? Sister?" "Because I've been reviewing some interesting real estate transactions." I pulled out my research commission complaint, complete with copies of those undisclosed sales contracts. "Seems you were closing attorney on several property sales where the seller, who shares your last name, forgot to mention ongoing boundary disputes with the federal government." The blood drained from his face faster than bathwater down a broken pipe. Back in my union days, I'd seen this exact expression during contract negotiations when management realized they'd been caught red-handed. It's the look of someone who's just figured out their clever scheme has a federal-sized hole in it. Those transactions are completely unrelated. Maybe, but the Real Estate Commission might find it fascinating that you're now suing the federal permit holder whose legal status should have been disclosed in every single sale you closed. I stood up, leaving his lawsuit papers scattered across his desk, like evidence at a crime scene. "Here's my counteroffer. Drop all HOA actions, and I'll consider not expanding my state complaint to include potential attorney misconduct." The walk to my truck felt like escaping from a tomb. Fresh mountain air hit my lungs, and through his office window, I could see David Kesler frantically shuffling papers like a man trying to hide a body. If I thought that would end things, I was wrong enough to get my own reality TV show. 3 days later, I came home from a hardware store run to find my main power line severed. Not weather damage, not equipment failure, cut. Clean diagonal slice through the cable about 10 feet from my electrical panel. The kind of precision that requires bolt cutters and criminal intent. Deputy Rodriguez arrived an hour after my call. Young guy with observant eyes and the methodical approach of someone who actually gave a damn about his job. He photographed everything, measured distances, and filled out paperwork with the thoroughness of a man building a case. "Definitely deliberate," he confirmed, examining the cut ends under his flashlight beam. "Clean angle, precise positioning. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were targeting." While I spliced the cable back together, muscle memory from 3 decades of emergency repairs, my neighbor Sal Ricci wandered over with a beer and that predatory grin Marines develop when they smell incoming action. "Interesting timing for electrical problems," he observed, settling onto my porch steps. "You see anything unusual today?" White Lexus with government plates cruising real slow around lunchtime. Same car that's been playing tourist in our neighborhood all week. Government plates. Brenda's city councilman husband drove a white Lexus courtesy of the taxpayers. Fascinating coincidence. "Sal, you ever consider a career change to neighborhood security?" His grin turned absolutely predatory. "Funny you mention that. Me and some VFW buddies were just discussing community watch programs. Amazing what military surplus night vision can spot these days." That evening, I installed 4 trail cameras around my property, hidden among the pines like electronic ghosts. Motion-activated, infrared-capable, and completely legal on my own land. If someone wanted to escalate to property crimes, they were about to learn that this electrician had some tricks left. The cameras paid for themselves 2 nights later with footage that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. Brenda Kesler herself, stumbling through my woods at 2 a.m. with a flashlight and what appeared to be a can of spray paint, muttering to herself like a woman who'd completely lost touch with reality. But the real prize came when she tripped over a root and dropped something that gleamed in the infrared light. Bolt cutters, still bearing flecks of copper from my severed power line. Game, set, and match. That infrared footage of Brenda stumbling through my woods should have been my victory moment. Instead, watching her mutter to herself like a woman possessed made me realize I was fighting the wrong war entirely. This wasn't about property rights or HOA overreach. This was something much deeper and more dangerous. I spent the next week haunting the county records office like a ghost looking for unfinished business. The clerk, a patient woman named Dorothy, who'd probably seen every flavor of land dispute in her 40-year career, helped me navigate filing cabinets that smelled like old paper and bureaucratic secrets. "You're not the first person to ask about the Kesler family," she mentioned, while pulling dusty folders from a cabinet marked Condemnation Cases 1960 to 1980. "That whole mess left scars on a lot of people. The original land patent hit me like a punch to the gut. 40,000 acres granted to Harold Kesler in 1923, pristine mountain forest that had stayed in the family for 3 generations. Until 1965, when the federal government decided they needed it for a highway project connecting 2 interstate systems. Eminent domain, the legal equivalent of "because we said so." The court records told a story that would break your heart. Thomas Kesler, Brenda's father, fought the condemnation for 12 years, mortgaging everything he owned to fund a David versus Goliath legal battle. The yellowed newspaper clippings painted him as a local hero, 4th-generation rancher trying to save his family's mountain from federal bulldozers. He lost everything. The highway project got canceled in 1974. Budget cuts and environmental concerns killed it, but the government had already seized the land. Instead of returning it to the Keslers, they auctioned off the excess acreage to private developers at bargain prices. Thomas Kesler died in 1978, bankrupt and broken. His obituary, preserved in the local paper's archives, mentioned survivors: wife Margaret, daughter Brenda, age 16. That 16-year-old girl had watched the federal government destroy her father, then hand their ancestral land to real estate speculators who carved it into vacation lots for wealthy outsiders. Every tree cut, every road paved, every house built on her family's former property was another nail in her father's coffin. Suddenly, Brenda's insane hatred of my federal permit made perfect sense. I wasn't just some retiree with proper paperwork. I was another person profiting from the system that killed her family. Every time she looked at my cabin, she saw federal authority flaunting its power over her mountain. The psychological profile clicked together like a completed circuit. Brenda hadn't become HOA president to boss around neighbors. She'd done it to finally have control over the land her family had lost. In her mind, she was protecting her father's memory from another federal invasion. This should have made me sympathetic. Instead, it terrified me, because now I understood she'd never stop. This wasn't a legal dispute she could lose gracefully. This was her life's defining trauma, and my cabin had become the symbol of everything she hated about government overreach. But here's what really chilled my blood. Digging deeper into the condemnation records, I found legal opinions from the 1970s questioning whether the government's land seizure had been constitutional in the first place. Several law professors had written papers arguing that the taking didn't meet federal requirements for public use. But by the time anyone cared enough to investigate, statutes of limitations had expired. Thomas Kesler had been right to fight. He'd just been outgunned by unlimited federal legal resources. That evening, I sat on my porch as mountain shadows crept across the valley, the weight of this knowledge pressing down like an approaching thunderstorm. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I barely noticed. I wasn't dealing with simple HOA corruption. I was dealing with 40 years of festering grief that had finally found a target. The question wasn't whether I could win this fight. The question was whether this mountain was big enough for both our ghosts. Understanding Brenda's 40-year-old grief changed my entire battle plan. You can't defeat trauma with property law, and you can't heal generational wounds with cease and desist letters. If I wanted to end this war without destroying either of us, I needed allies who understood that sometimes the best way to win is to help your enemy find peace. My first call went to David Kim, a civil rights attorney who specialized in cases where federal authority collided with local politics. Sal had recommended him after hearing my story. Apparently, David had helped several veterans fight wrongful foreclosures when local banks tried to ignore federal protections. David's office sat above the town's only Thai restaurant, and the smell of pad Thai and legal documents created an oddly comforting atmosphere while he reviewed my permits and Brenda's family history. His silver hair and patient manner suggested someone who'd spent decades untangling messes where law and human heartbreak intersected. Federal supremacy is bulletproof, he said, tapping my special use permit with a scarred finger. But here's something most people don't know. When Congress passed the major federal land laws in the 1970s, they included provisions for addressing historical injustices. Your case isn't just about defending your rights. It's about fixing a 40-year-old wrong. That little-known fact hit me like a revelation. Federal law doesn't just protect current permit holders. It actually provides mechanisms for healing old wounds caused by government overreach. My second ally materialized through pure bureaucratic serendipity. Patricia Kai from the Forest Service called to follow up on my permit status and casually mentioned she'd been digging through classified files about the area's history. Apparently, my case had triggered her professional curiosity about historical land grabs. The 1965 environmental study is still under wraps, she told me over coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration. But I can say that multiple federal agencies opposed that highway project from day one. The condemnation never should have been approved. Patricia had that gleam in her eye that government employees get when they discover a bureaucratic injustice worth fixing. Her willingness to investigate suggested this case had become personal for her too. Jake Morrison provided the local political intelligence during lunch at Murphy's BBQ, where the smoke from the pit made everything smell like victory, and the sauce was hot enough to strip paint. Between bites of ribs that fell off the bone, he laid out the delicious irony of my situation. Tom Kesler, Brenda's husband, has been pushing development projects that require federal environmental permits, Jake explained, wiping sauce from his chin with the methodical precision of a man who understood proper barbecue protocol. If his wife's crusade against federal authority succeeds, it could torpedo his entire political career. The beautiful contradiction made me laugh out loud. Brenda's war against my federal permit was undermining her husband's political ambitions, which depended entirely on federal cooperation. Sometimes karma has a sense of humor. My strategy crystallized during several late-night planning sessions in my cabin, fueled by coffee strong enough to wake the dead and mountain silence that sharpened my thinking better than any corporate retreat. Instead of just defending my turf, I'd go on offense by addressing the historical crime that started this whole mess. The legal framework was elegant in its simplicity. David would file a quiet title action to permanently establish my federal rights while simultaneously petitioning for a historical review of the original Kesler condemnation. Patricia would provide federal muscle and access to buried documents. Jake would monitor local politics and document any misuse of government resources. But the real breakthrough came from Sarah Mitchell, the 78-year-old retired editor who'd covered the original condemnation battle as a young reporter. When she visited my cabin, her eyes still sparkled with the predatory instincts of a journalist who'd found an unfinished story. Thomas Kesler was fighting the right fight against the wrong system, she said, accepting coffee from my thermos while mountain wind rustled the pines around us. But he made one fatal mistake. He fought alone. You've got something he never had. Allies who understand how power really works in this country. Sarah's offer to resurrect the story for the regional newspaper added a media component that would keep everyone honest. Nothing motivates politicians and bureaucrats quite like the prospect of their names appearing in unflattering headlines. The final piece clicked into place when Sal organized a meeting with local veterans who dealt with similar federal land issues. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a coalition with political connections, legal experience, and the institutional memory that comes from decades of battling government incompetence. Here's what Brenda doesn't understand, Sal observed during our final planning session, nursing a beer while we reviewed our timeline. She's been fighting this war for 40 years, but she's been shooting at the wrong target. The real villains are the federal bureaucrats who destroyed her family, not the guy with a legal permit trying to drink coffee in peace. Our mission had evolved beyond simple property rights. We were going to heal a wound that had been festering since before I'd even met Linda, and maybe, just maybe, give both Brenda and her father's memory the justice they'd been denied. Time to see if old ghosts could finally find peace. If I thought my alliance building would intimidate Brenda into backing down, I'd underestimated how deep her family trauma ran. Instead of retreating, she doubled down with the desperation of someone who'd rather burn everything down than admit defeat. The first sign of escalation came when a private investigator showed up at my cabin, a weaselly guy in an ill-fitting suit who claimed to be conducting a routine insurance survey, while obviously photographing everything he could see through my windows. When I asked for his credentials, he mumbled something about property assessments and scurried back to his rental car like a cockroach fleeing sunlight. Sal spotted the same PI lurking around the neighborhood for 3 days, taking pictures of residents' homes and interviewing anyone willing to talk. Apparently, Brenda had hired professional dirt diggers to find something, anything, that would destroy my credibility before our showdown. What the investigator found was exactly nothing. 30 years of union employment, clean criminal record, military service record, and a credit score that would make a banker weep with joy. The most scandalous thing in my background was a speeding ticket from 1987, and that time I got into a shouting match with a building inspector who was demanding bribes. But Brenda's desperation showed in her next move. She convinced her city councilman husband to pressure Jake Morrison through official channels. Tom Kesler called the county building department, demanding Jake's supervisor review my permits for irregularities and threatening budget consequences if the inspection wasn't thorough enough. Jake called me that evening, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Garrett, I've been doing this job for 23 years, and nobody has ever questioned my professional integrity until today. Tom Kesler just spent an hour implying I'm either incompetent or corrupt." The beautiful irony was that pressuring a county inspector to change his professional opinion is exactly the kind of ethics violation that ends political careers. Jake had already reported the call to the county ethics board, and Tom Kesler was about to discover that threatening civil servants creates permanent enemies. Meanwhile, Brenda's third escalation involved her husband's political connections at the federal level. She'd somehow gotten their congressman's office to file an inquiry with the Forest Service, demanding they review my permit for potential fraud or misrepresentation. Patricia Kai called me with barely contained amusement. "I got the strangest call today from Congressman Bradley's office, asking us to investigate whether your permit was obtained through false information. I told them I'd be happy to review the file again, but that it might take several months given our current workload." Translation: a federal bureaucrat was about to teach a small-town politician the difference between local influence and federal indifference. Congressional inquiries that lack merit tend to disappear into the vast machinery of government review processes, where they can languish for years without resolution. But Brenda's most desperate move was also her most revealing. She tried to have me committed for a mental health evaluation. I came home from a supply run to find 2 sheriff's deputies on my porch, looking about as comfortable as cats in a dog show. Deputy Rodriguez, who'd investigated my vandalism complaint, was there with his supervisor, both of them clearly unhappy with their assignment. "Mr. Walsh," the supervisor began, "we received a call expressing concern about your mental state. Someone reported you've been acting erratically, making threats, and showing signs of dangerous isolation since your wife's death." The accusation hit me like a punch to the gut, not because it was true, but because it was so perfectly calculated to hurt. Brenda had weaponized Linda's memory and my grief, turning my healing process into evidence of mental instability. "Who made this report?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Anonymous caller, but we're required to do a welfare check when someone expresses genuine concern for public safety." Rodriguez looked like he wanted to crawl under a rock. "Sir, I know this is uncomfortable, but we need to ask. Have you been experiencing thoughts of harming yourself or others? Any unusual behavior patterns, paranoid thoughts, anger management issues?" I invited them inside, made coffee, and spent 20 minutes calmly explaining my legal situation, my support network, and my completely rational response to systematic harassment. By the time they left, both deputies were shaking their heads at the waste of their time. "For what it's worth," Rodriguez said as they walked to their patrol car, "whoever called this in just committed a crime. Filing false reports to law enforcement is a misdemeanor, and if we can prove it was done maliciously, it becomes a felony." That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, and realized Brenda had crossed a line that changed everything. Using my wife's death against me wasn't just legally questionable. It was morally indefensible. She'd just transformed our property dispute into something personal and ugly, which meant the gloves were coming off. If Brenda wanted to fight dirty, she was about to learn that electricians know how to handle live wires without getting shocked. Time to show her what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. Brenda's attempt to use Linda's memory as a weapon against me was the kind of mistake that reveals someone's true character and creates permanent enemies. If she thought attacking a widower's grief would make me back down, she'd badly miscalculated the difference between depression and determination. Her next move proved she'd completely lost touch with reality. She organized an emergency HOA meeting to vote on hiring additional legal counsel and implementing a special assessment of $2,500 per household to fund what she called community protection litigation. $2,500 per house to fight one retiree with a legal federal permit. The meeting notice arrived on a Friday, scheduled for the following Monday evening. Barely enough time for working families to arrange childcare or adjust their schedules. Classic power move from someone who'd confused manipulation with leadership. But Brenda had underestimated how her recent behavior had turned neighbors against her. Word about the private investigator, the pressure campaign against county employees, and the false mental health report had spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire. When you live in a small community, that kind of conduct doesn't stay secret long. The community center was packed beyond capacity when I arrived Monday night, but the atmosphere felt different from previous meetings. Instead of the usual mix of boredom and resignation, I sensed real anger simmering beneath the surface. Folding chairs creaked under shifting weight as neighbors who'd never spoken at HOA meetings whispered urgently among themselves. Brenda opened with her usual PowerPoint presentation, but this time her slides focused on defending community values against federal overreach. She'd somehow convinced herself that my cabin represented the thin edge of a government conspiracy to seize private property throughout Pine Ridge. "This isn't just about one illegal structure," she declared, clicking through images of various federal buildings as if they were evidence of impending invasion. "It's about protecting our right to local self-determination against bureaucrats who think they can override community standards." The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. A woman whose family had been destroyed by federal overreach was now demanding the right to commit local overreach against someone with proper federal authorization. But Brenda's presentation fell apart when residents started asking uncomfortable questions. Janet Morrison, Jake's wife, and a retired teacher with zero tolerance for nonsense, stood up with a folder full of research that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. "Brenda, I've been reviewing HOA expenditures for the past 3 years," Janet announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd managed classroom discipline for 30 years. "Can you explain why $47,000 in consulting fees went to companies owned by board members? Because that sure looks like self-dealing to me." The room went dead silent except for the ancient heating system's wheeze and the sound of Brenda's political career imploding in real time. Those were legitimate architectural review services. "For reviewing what?" Janet shot back. "We haven't had any major construction projects requiring outside consultation, but we have had board members voting to pay their own companies with our dues money. The beautiful thing about small-town politics is that financial irregularities can't hide behind corporate complexity. When everyone knows everyone, embezzlement looks exactly like what it is, stealing from your neighbors. But the real knockout punch came from an unexpected source. Tom Kesler, Brenda's own husband, stood up near the back of the room with the expression of a man who'd reached the end of his political rope. "I think everyone needs to know that the County Ethics Board has opened an investigation into my conduct regarding Mr. Walsh's permits," he announced, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone reading his own political obituary. "And the State Attorney General is reviewing potential misuse of city resources in this matter." You could have heard a pin drop in that room. A city councilman publicly acknowledging ethics violations is like a pilot announcing engine failure. It gets everyone's immediate attention. Tom continued, "I want to apologize to Mr. Walsh and to this community for allowing personal feelings to compromise my professional responsibilities. The pressure my wife has been under regarding her family's history doesn't excuse what's happened here." Brenda's face went through several color changes that would have been comical if the situation weren't so tragic. Her husband had just thrown her under the political bus in front of the entire neighborhood, and everyone knew their marriage was probably over before they got home. The special assessment vote failed 31-8, with only Brenda's closest allies supporting continued litigation. But more importantly, someone called for a vote of no confidence in her leadership, which passed 28-11. As the meeting broke up, neighbors who'd never spoken to me before stopped to shake my hand and apologize for the harassment I'd endured. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who'd lived in Pine Ridge longer than anyone, grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Your wife would be proud of how you handled this," she said, her eyes bright with tears. "Some fights are worth having, and you picked the right one." Walking to my truck under a canopy of stars, I realized Brenda's war against my cabin had accomplished something she'd never intended. It had united a community around the principle that grief doesn't justify cruelty, and power doesn't excuse abuse. The only question now was whether she'd accept defeat gracefully or force us all to watch her final self-destruction. 3 days after the disastrous HOA meeting, Brenda made one last desperate play that would either vindicate her family's 40-year fight or destroy what remained of her reputation. She called for an open community forum, inviting county officials, local media, and anyone interested in the truth about federal land grabs in Pine Ridge Estates. The community center had never seen a crowd like this. Sarah Mitchell arrived with a photographer from the regional newspaper. County Supervisor Williams drove up from town with 2 assistants, and Patricia Kai made the trip from the Forest Service regional office. Even Congressman Bradley's local representative showed up, probably wondering how a simple HOA dispute had escalated to federal attention. The air crackled with tension as thick as the smell of burnt coffee from the center's ancient percolator. Folding chairs filled every available space, with overflow crowds standing along the walls like witnesses at a trial. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It had become a referendum on how communities handle power, grief, and justice. Brenda opened with the presentation of her life, 40 years of accumulated pain and anger focused into a laser-precise attack on federal authority. She'd prepared charts showing property value impacts, legal briefs questioning permit validity, and emotional testimony about government overreach destroying family legacies. 40 years ago, the federal government stole my family's land under false pretenses, she declared, her voice shaking with genuine emotion. They promised a highway that was never built, seized property that was never needed, and sold our heritage to developers for profit. Now they're doing it again, using bureaucratic permits to override local authority and community standards. For a moment, watching her channel decades of grief into righteous fury, I almost felt sorry for her. This wasn't just about my cabin, it was about a teenage girl who'd watched her father die fighting an unjust system, and who'd spent her adult life trying to prevent anyone else from suffering the same fate. But then she crossed the line that transformed sympathy into disgust. Mr. Walsh represents everything wrong with federal overreach, she continued, pointing directly at me like a prosecutor identifying a criminal. A man who uses his wife's death to gain sympathy while exploiting government loopholes to violate community standards. His so-called grief cabin is really a deliberate assault on property values and local authority. The room went dead silent. Using Linda's memory as a political weapon was bad enough in private. Doing it in front of 200 neighbors crossed into something unforgivable. That's when I stood up, carrying the folder that contained 40 years of truth. Brenda, you're absolutely right about one thing, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Your family was wronged by the federal government. Your father fought a just cause against an unjust system, and he deserved better than he got. Her expression shifted from aggression to confusion, clearly not expecting agreement from her target. But here's what you don't know about that injustice, I continued, pulling out Patricia Kai's declassified documents. The highway project that destroyed your family was opposed by multiple federal agencies from the beginning. The condemnation was approved by corrupt officials who ignored their own environmental experts and legal advisors. I turned to address the crowd directly. Patricia Kai from the Forest Service has spent weeks investigating the original Kesler case. Patricia, would you mind sharing what you found? Patricia stood with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent years navigating bureaucratic minefields. The 1965 Environmental Impact Study, declassified last week, shows that the highway project was scientifically unsound and legally questionable from inception. The condemnation proceeded despite written objections from the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, and the Army Corps of Engineers. She held up a thick folder. Moreover, internal memos from 1974 show that returning the land to the Kesler family was discussed and rejected for purely political reasons. The officials who approved the original condemnation didn't want to admit their mistake. The crowd murmured as people processed this revelation. Brenda's face went white as she realized her lifelong enemy wasn't federal authority in general. It was specific corrupt officials who'd betrayed their oath of office. Here's what we're proposing, I continued, pulling out David Kim's legal brief. A joint petition to Congress for a formal review of the Kesler condemnation, with the goal of posthumous vindication for Thomas Kesler and potential restitution for the family. The mic drop moment came when I looked directly at Brenda. Your father was a patriot who trusted his government to do the right thing. He wasn't fighting federal authority. He was fighting federal corruption. And 40 years later, that same federal authority is finally ready to admit he was right. County Supervisor Williams stepped forward, clearly seeing an opportunity to be on the right side of history. The county is prepared to support any federal investigation into historical land use violations and will cooperate fully with efforts to honor Thomas Kesler's memory. Brenda sat down heavily. Her 40-year war suddenly transformed from personal vendetta into potential family vindication. The room erupted in applause, not for victory over an enemy, but for justice finally served. Sarah Mitchell was already typing furiously on her laptop, probably writing the story that would resurrect Thomas Kesler's reputation and heal wounds that had festered for 4 decades. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to help your enemy discover they've been fighting the wrong war. 6 months later, I'm sitting on my cabin porch with morning coffee steaming in the crisp mountain air, reading Sarah Mitchell's latest article about how our little HOA war accidentally exposed a 40-year pattern of federal land corruption that reached clear to Washington, D.C. The congressional investigation moved faster than anyone expected, probably because election season makes politicians eager to champion historical injustices with photogenic victims and clear villains. Thomas Kesler was posthumously vindicated. The original condemnation declared legally invalid, and the Kesler family received both a formal federal apology and restitution that made Brenda financially comfortable for life. More importantly, Congress passed the Thomas Kesler Memorial Land Justice Act, establishing an ombudsman office to investigate historical federal land violations and prevent future abuse. My little cabin dispute had accidentally stumbled into a much larger story about government accountability and healing generational wounds. Brenda and I had coffee together last week, a conversation that would have seemed impossible during our war. But shared trauma has a way of creating unexpected understanding. She apologized for weaponizing Linda's memory, and I apologized for not recognizing her family's pain sooner. We're not exactly friends, but we're no longer enemies, which feels like genuine progress. "You know the strangest part?" she said, the autumn wind rustling pine needles above us while she stirred honey into her mug. "Daddy would have loved this place. He always said mountains belong to people who respected them, not corporations that carved them into profit margins." The HOA elected new leadership and completely reformed their approach, focusing on community building rather than enforcement. They established the Pine Ridge Heritage Conservation Fund, a program that provides college scholarships for local kids studying environmental science, land management, or public administration, with preference given to students from families affected by historical land disputes. Last month, they awarded the first scholarship to Maria Santos, whose grandfather lost farmland to a similar eminent domain abuse in the 1980s. Watching her grandmother cry with pride at the ceremony reminded everyone why healing old wounds matters more than winning current fights. Tom Kesler resigned from city council but avoided criminal charges after cooperating fully with the ethics investigation. Their marriage survived, barely, but they're working through accumulated resentment with professional counseling. Sometimes love requires more than good intentions. It needs honest conversation and proper tools. The community transformation has been remarkable. Property values actually increased after media attention brought positive recognition to Pine Ridge as a place where neighbors solve problems together instead of destroying each other. 3 new families moved here specifically because they wanted to live somewhere with proven community spirit and conflict resolution skills. My cabin became an unofficial grief counseling center and veteran support hub. Linda would have loved that. She always believed home should be where people find peace, not just shelter. I've hosted everything from widows' coffee groups to PTSD support meetings, and somehow helping others heal accelerated my own recovery in ways therapy never managed. The federal investigation led to policy changes preventing future Thomas Kesler situations. But more importantly, it proved that ordinary citizens can hold government accountable when they're willing to do the research and build the right alliances. David Kim now specializes in historical land rights. Patricia Kai got promoted to regional director, and Jake Morrison received a state award for professional integrity under political pressure. Last month, I started building a workshop behind the cabin. Linda had always wanted me to have proper woodworking space. The new structure required another federal permit, which arrived without controversy in record time. Amazing how efficiently bureaucracy works when everyone's pulling in the same direction instead of different ones. I've been thinking about what story to tell next, because this experience taught me that everyone carries unfinished business worth fighting for. And sometimes the best way to honor lost loved ones is helping others find justice for their buried grief. The smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace drifts across the valley as I finish this story, mixing with pine scent and the faint sound of children playing in the distance. Sounds of a community that's learned to heal instead of hurt. Here's your homework. Drop a comment and share your most outrageous HOA horror story. I know some of you have dealt with power-hungry neighbors who make Brenda look like a reasonable human being, and those stories deserve daylight. And smash that subscribe button for Karen stories, because next month I'm telling you what happened when my new neighbor tried building a helicopter landing pad without permits, thinking his political donations would override federal aviation law. Spoiler, the FAA doesn't care how much money you've thrown at local politicians. Thanks for following this journey from property dispute to community healing. Sometimes the best victories aren't about defeating enemies, they're about helping everyone make peace with their ghosts.